He then spent the next 18 years imprisoned on Robben Island. Now, Robben Island, as you also explain in the book, already has quite notorious memories for Mandela. He's heard of this before, hasn't he?
He had, yes. I mean, Robben Island was used as a prison island, really, for political prisoners. It had been used for several hundred years. It had various different uses, but some of the early African chiefs who resisted white rule in the first place during the kind of beginning of the colonial era were incarcerated on Robben Island, and these chiefs became the heroes of the later generations of African nationalists. And because they had been sent to Robben Island to exile, it was essentially a place of exile. Mandela knew all about it from an early age, as a young man sitting around the campfire listening to stories about African history.
He remained an enigmatic figure during his time in prison. In fact, you say that prison colleagues who were his companions for years on end sometimes felt they didn't really know him.
Yes, prison made him an intensely private person. Even with his closest friends, he always was careful to hide his real feelings. He was anxious never to betray the slightest sign of weakness, either to his own colleagues or to prison staff. And that sort of attempt at self-control became an abiding habit. But it was certainly the case is that people like McCrossan, who knew him extremely well and is one of his closest friends, when I was interviewing him for the book, was very clear about how difficult it was sometimes to understand what Mandela's real feelings were, what his real thoughts were, that he would come back to his prison cell, sometimes having learnt of some momentous event which was going to affect all their lives, and yet would sit down and talk quite calmly about some other matter, and sometimes hide the real impact of a momentous event until a more appropriate time. And it's this kind of determination, this self-control, this sort of iron grip that he has on his own conduct that he refined in prison, and certainly his colleagues found it quite difficult to understand sometimes what he was thinking.
He was released onto the world stage in 1990, and that kind of marks another journey for him, the road to the presidency. Looking back now, with hindsight, it seems obvious, that journey. Was it obvious at the time of his release that he was going to be the next South African president?
No, there was in some ways a great deal of uncertainty. One of the reasons why the white government, the apartheid, the rulers of South Africa released him was because they were convinced that they would be able to outmaneuver him, that they would be able to construct an anti-Mandela, anti-ANC alliance with various black opponents of the African National Congress. And it was because of that was a huge miscalculation on the part of the white politicians, but they weren't particularly well versed in what was going on in the African political world. But they certainly had enormous resources and security forces, huge government revenues and so on, and they believed that they had such a preponderance of power is that they would be able to outmaneuver Mandela. So it was by no means certain when he was released that he would become president. There were various attempts by all kinds of interested parties, extreme right-wing parties, the police, the military, people in the police and the people in the military, to try the various maneuvers to try and ensure that Mandela never ever got to the point of where he was able to contest an election and win it. But all these maneuvers failed. But it was not by any means a guaranteed result come Mandela's release in 1990 that he would necessarily come out on top. Indeed, there was there were periods of extreme violence which occurred after his release. And it was entirely possible that the exercise of releasing him and moving towards elections and proper democracy could have failed. There was no certainty of the outcome that occurred in 1994.
His private life was also plagued with difficulty and disaster due to his wife, Winnie, I suppose. Some say that she found it difficult because she had been the face of Nelson for all those years of his captivity, and then he was released and she was then back to the shadows. This hurt him quite a lot, didn't it, the breakdown in the relationship with Winnie and his family?
Well, yes. He's had 3 marriages. The first one was to a fairly kind of simple country girl who didn't understand his passion for politics and hoped that he would give it up. But he was rather callous towards her, and indeed he was alienated to a certain extent from his own, from the children of that marriage. And when he first caught sight of Winnie, at that particular time, he was 38 years old then. He was on trial for treason, which could have got him a death sentence. His law practice was disintegrating. His own kind of children hardly knew him, and it was something of almost a sort of an impulsive move to kind of get on to Winnie. But he fell in love with her almost on sight. And Winnie, again, was a relatively simple country girl at the time. But it was clear that this was a marriage, when he eventually married Winnie, that was not going to be anything like a normal marriage. Winnie hardly ever saw him. And he was always on the go, politically active, and then he went underground before he was arrested and charged with sabotage and violence to overthrow the government. So, but nevertheless, when he went to prison, it was this passionate love for Winnie which in some ways kept him going. He describes how he used to touch a photograph of her every night to sort of say goodnight. It was one of those sort of links with the outside world which he cherished more than anything else. Unfortunately, Winnie was a fairly kind of wayward character. As you say, she did try to sort of take over Mandela's mantle, but she was pretty reckless and foolish. And eventually she became involved basically with gangster activity. She became the head of a criminal gang based in Soweto, which was involved in murder and torture and arson, and terrified the local residents. And this was happening at a time when Mandela was still in jail. And when he came out, he was faced with this sort of nightmare world in which Winnie, who he'd loved and revered and cherished so much, was then turned out to be nothing more than a criminal menace, basically. So it was certainly true that it went to Winnie's head that she believed that she was sort of carrying the Mandela flame and keeping it alight, and that was certainly true. And the way in which the South African government persecuted her endlessly, locked her in solitary confinement for months on end, that changed her character, as indeed she admits. And she did become forceful and rather brutal and unfeeling. And it was a great shock to Mandela when he came out of prison and found that she, in a sense, believed in her own ability to lead the nationalist struggle. She was also blatantly pursuing her own other love interests. She had a huge number of lovers. And even on the night that Mandela finally got home after being locked up for 27 years, as he later said, she just wasn't interested in sharing the same bed with him. And it was an extremely painful and distressing kind of experience.